Okay, I want to introduce the folks in here. These are the offspring of many doctors, but 5 are still here in Leesburg. You'll hear in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and later. So beginning over here to my far right is my brother Butch, or Vincent O'Kelly Jr., and then we have Dr. Farrell Young, and then we have Ronald Eugene, and we have Paul Buchanan, we have Bill Benavell, Jeff Benavell, and Chris Engelhardt Mead. So we're going to briefly have each one of the doctors, we're going to go kind of in alphabetical order, to speak a little bit about their father and their years, where they began, their history from hopefully early years prior to becoming a doctor, where they're from, some of the experiences that they had while they were doctors here. And so I think the earliest doctor coming would be probably in the mid-30s. I'm not sure if there's one prior to. There are several doctors that we'd like to talk about briefly that are not here. Dr. Morrison was one of the early doctors, was here in probably early 30s or maybe even late 20s. So he was one of the doctors here in that period of time. I'm not sure when he stopped practice. Then we have a Dr. Holland, who came here probably in the early 30s as well. Okay, some of the other doctors in that period of time, and you guys can pitch in with more, Dr. Perry, Dr. Ford, Dr. Leroy Otchen. Belchute. Oh, no, this one is right.
And Dr. Brokaw.
Dr. Bergen Brokaw as well. Any other names out there you'd like to shout out?
Who did Dr. Otchen's daughter marry?
Dr. Tumlin, Paul
Tumlin.
Tumlin.
Paul Tumlin.
Could be.
That was
Not
another
sure.
doctor.
And Dr. Otchen's son, Leroy, became a doctor in Orlando.
Right. I believe he is still there. I looked his name up the other day as well. He is 86 years old. And so he used to live on Lake Harris across this History Park.
He had the fastest boat on Lake Harris.
Yeah, he had a swift
Yes.
craft. So those doctors were present here during those times.
Dr. Brady.
Brady, Dr. Brady,
Tutton.
Dr. Tutton, yes. Dr. Tumlin,
Dr. Jack Owen.
Jack Owen, yes. Actually, Jack Owen, his name is Marion Owen. My father delivered him, and they named him Marion, which is my father's name. Okay. So I've learned that about 30 years ago. He is no longer in the area. I'm not sure if he's still living. All right, we're going to go start with the program now with the first doctor's kids, which will be the Benavells. This is Bill and Jeff.
Thank you, John. It is a pleasure to be here. It gives us an opportunity to dust off scrapbooks, old newspaper articles, from something we haven't looked at a long time. But I will start out here. That's Mom and Dad in the center of the picture. I'm going to start out also, you mentioned Dr. Holland. Up in the top left-hand corner, that is where Dad practiced in his hospital. That was the Teresa Holland Hospital and Clinic. Dr. Holland actually built that in 1948. And then when the hospital, Leesburg Regional Hospital, came into play, and Paul's going to address a little bit more about this, after a couple of years of the hospital being in existence, Dad tore down his hospital and remodeled his clinic, which is in the top right-hand corner there. And that's the building that is there today. It's across from Byers Funeral Home. Bottom right-hand corner is the hospital wing, which was behind the clinic itself. And over in the left hand is, I'll go over that in a minute, but that's Mom and Dad on their wedding day. Dad was born in Long Branch, New Jersey in 1919. He moved to down here. He and both Mom moved down here in their early childhood. When Dad was about 10 years old, not sure how old Mom was, But they did their elementary school here in Leesburg. Believe it or not, they graduated from Leesburg High School. Mom was about 2 years behind him. She always said she had a crush on him, but he never knew anything about her. So after high school, Dad went to the University of Virginia, did his undergraduate work there, and did his medical school there. Mom eventually followed him up there, and she went to nursing school there. And she graduated nursing school, and after Dad graduated medical school, the next day they were married. And that's their picture on the chapel of the University of Virginia. That was 1944, I guess it was. After medical school, they had to go to New York City, where Dad did his 4 years of surgical residency at the New York Postgraduate School. He was there 4 years and finished that in 1948. And then they came down to Leesburg, and he started working with Dr. Holland. Dr. Holland retired in 1948, and in 1951, Dad bought the hospital from Dr. Holland. He practiced about 2 years, and then the Korean War was in effect at that time, and at that time there was concerns that Dad would be drafted. And there were concerns with that the hospital would close because he was practicing by himself. Well, the community came together and did a lot of letter writing and petitioning to the local draft board because of the hardship it would place on the community by closing a hospital. Well, needless to say, unfortunately, they declined his exemption to stay out of the draft. So he did have to go to Korea, and he spent 20 months over in Korea with the U.S. General Surgeon's office. And I'm proud to say, too, during that 20 years, he was awarded Bronze Star in Korea. He came back in May of 1955 and resumed his practice, and just kind of came across some figures with the volume of patients that came to his office just a few months after he came back from Korea. September 1955, there were 2,155 patients that came to the clinic. He did 16 operations and 5 deliveries. I don't see how he did that, but he managed, and it just goes to show you what a little town of community, or little town of Leesburg can do with that. As we mentioned, there at that time, there were only 2 specialists, Dr. Perry and Dr. Chu. I'd like to go over some fond childhood memories that we had of Dad during his practice. Guatemala family. This is pretty interesting. There was a young Guatemala family who came here, and they stayed in the Magnolia Hotel down there on Magnolia Street, and the parents got a very bad case of food poisoning. They had two little girls. I guess their ages were probably about maybe 8 and 10, and couldn't speak a lick of English. And the parents had to be admitted to the hospital. Well, that was the first concern. Second concern, what we're going to do with the little girls. Well, Mom and Dad, no problem. They're going to stay with us, and they did. And they did find, I think, someone to help interpret for them, but there was a lot of nodding and this and smiling, and that was about it, and swimming in the swimming pool. But the parents had to stay in the hospital. I think it was for several days, but they eventually got better and went on their way. But again, you can imagine 2 little girls couldn't speak a lick of English at all, and what we did with them was just have fun and let them swim in the pool. The Sunday dinners were something that we really enjoyed at the hospital because we had an excellent staff of cooks in the kitchen. But it saved Mom in cooking, but what was really fun on Sundays was that was circumcision day for the baby boys that were delivered that week, and Jeff and I got to welcome into the manlyhood. And all I can say about that is after the fact is ouch. But those were some rewarding experiences. Other aspects of it was, I think, in the middle of the night, we received a phone call, Dad did, that Leesburg Tire and Battery was on fire. This was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest fire that Leesburg ever had. Leesburg Tire and Battery was kind of catty-corner across from the hospital, and he got the call because they were fearful that the fire might spread. It was that big over to the hospital. Luckily, it did not. All we did was just watch a great glow in the sky, but it was a huge fire. The nursing staff was family to us. In fact, Ronnie, Nancy's mother, was one of Dad's nurses, Kate Miller. She was a sweetheart. But also, out of this came a very special person that we love dearly. There was a housekeeper. She was a black housekeeper that worked in the hospital, who eventually became the homekeeper at Mom and Dad's house. Her name was Annabelle Mincy, and she practically raised us with the time we spent with Mom and Dad having to go to medical meetings, vacations, whatever. She spent the night with us, and we came to love that lady dearly. She was a member of the family. And she could be any one of us in here in Checkers as well, too. House calls, hospital visits in the middle of the night. Mom was a nurse, and she did work with Dad periodically, not all the time. But those times she was working, she'd have to go possibly on the house calls with Dad or in deliveries in the middle of the night. What would we do? We were little, we couldn't stay at the house by ourselves, so they packed us up in the station wagon and went on down to the hospital and made those house calls, and we slept in the car. That's all we did. All right, it's kind of mixed up here, but let's start. Anybody know in the top left here who that gentleman is there?
Nope.
Remember Nick's Cafe downtown? That's Nick Baboris. Best steak in town. And then my dad wearing a derby. I think that was taken probably during the centennial because everybody was required to wear derbies. Also, men were required to have beards. But as you notice, Dad didn't have a beard. He wasn't going to grow one. And if you were caught without a beard, the Keystone cops would put you in jail. Well, they did come into Nick's after him, but he outran him down the street. No problem. Down below is Dad getting presented with the bronze medal in the service. You'll see his younger picture there. In the middle up to below is Dad, my mother, with him. Up below, I believe that was Jeff. Jeff and my sister Pat were born while he was doing residency up in New York. The guy to the left, he looks better then than he does now. And over to the far right, you'll see Dad, but that was Dr. Holland's picture up there as well too. I think that picture's in the Historical Society, John? Right. And then down below, you'll see Jeff as well, and another picture of Dad. These are just miscellaneous pictures of Dad during procedures. Over there on the left, you can see that was my sister Pat. She was a debutante here when they had, I guess it was a poinsettia ball. Yeah, debutante. And she is in Columbus, Georgia, and still just as pretty as she was there. In the middle is Dad with Dr. Young. I don't know if Ronnie Farrell, you recognize the other. I'm sure they were doctors, but I don't know who they were. Those are in later years. Down below, left-hand corner, that's my mom and Dad with Dr. and Mrs. Buchanan, who were very close to us during those years. What fond memories I have of Dr. Buchanan, on his off days, he would take Paul and I skiing. And I don't know who had more fun, us skiing or him watching us drown ourselves learning barefoot. Down below in the right, that is Dad in later years. That vest that he was wearing is something he cherished more than probably his surgical scrubs. His main hobby in life was model railroading. And as we were growing up, I kind of thought it strange, a grown man playing with toys. But in my later years, he took me to one of the train meets. That was the Florida Train Collectors Association. And I didn't know it was such a big deal. But he would come home from work during the days and escape to his training room, and we wouldn't see him till the next morning. But just a way to relieve his stress as well. Additional hobbies he had was photography. When the hospital was opened, Leesburg Regional, that did relieve them of some additional stress you can imagine. Just allowed him to remove himself from the administrative requirements at the hospital, his hospital, and additional doctors. He eventually just closed his practice to be a family practitioner. So it gave him more time. The hospital, Leesburg Regional, gave him more time to spend with hobbies and vacationing. And he loved photography. They had several trips on to Africa for photography safaris as well. And he also liked to grow cactus as well too. Jeff, do you have anything additional you want to add?
I have nothing to add. It's all-
Okay. I don't want to take a lot of time, but Dad retired in 1988 after 40 years of practice. And during our childhood, we had no idea of the what am I trying to say? What he had to give up to practice medicine. And we really weren't appreciative of that until right now, looking back. And it really makes us proud when we go down the street, and we're still getting this these days. My dad delivered, or your dad delivered me, did a surgical procedure on me, and when we hear that, it makes us very proud, believe me. And we're be proud of what he did for here in Leesburg. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next doctor's youngster is Paul Buchanan.
Well, this is a large 20 people. Or we suspected, I think, coming here. My dad grew up in Winchester, New Hampshire. Went to school, medical school in McGill. Actually went to undergraduate school and medical school at McGill, which is in Montreal. I think that university's been around since it's like 1829 or something. They've been around a long time. And after graduating from medical school, he ended up about in World War II and served in the Pacific, and they were MASH surgeons, just like on TV. And fortunately, got through all that, and then came back to the Boston area to practice. And then, I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but he ended up at Tampa General. And he was director or head of pediatrics. And as it happened to turn out, my mother, who was an RN at Tampa General, was head RN or head nurse of the pediatric program there. So they got married, I think in 1950, and I showed up in 1951. In a way that, back in the days that we're talking about, there weren't any specialists, and and I'm gonna steal Ronnie's description, that these doctors were from head to toe. You know, there wasn't any baby doctor, there wasn't any trauma surgeon. You know, the trauma was in World War II and that kind of stuff that they learned. So, and I think one of the unique things I remember so much about this, and these guys will remember it, is they made house calls.
Yeah.
Come on, man. You mean at 9 o'clock at night, call your doctor and he'll come over, or at least he'll answer the phone and tell you what you ought to do. Matter of fact, I brought my dad's bag that he had since 1948, I guess. And, you know, they would come and make those diagnoses. And a lot of people, quite frankly, didn't have the money to even have a doctor. But you always had a doctor. These doctors did a lot for free, and then those patients, I'd come home from school on a bicycle many times, and there'd be stacked up corn, or there'd be watermelons, and, you know, or just whatever. These folks, you know, proud people, they weren't trying to get anything for nothing. And the whole medical family in this area, you know, everybody kind of took care of everybody. And at that time, again, you know, there weren't any specialists or anything, and so you may get your tonsils out, or you may, you know, have a gunshot wound and that type of thing going on. Anyway, my father came and moved back to Leesburg and became associated with Durham Young Hospital. We think it's 1948, something like that. And during that time, he got a nurse, you know, named Ronnie Wrinkle. And anybody's lived here very long knows she was a class lady. Daughter right over there, Sherry. I like to describe her as a wonderful Nurse Ratchet. They could direct traffic there. I mean, she made things happen. And she was loved by all. She was with my dad until he passed away in 1971. Then I think that she went with Dr. Young. Dr. Young helped Dr. Young until he retired, and then to Dr. Robinson at one point there. And she told me a couple stories that I thought were pretty good. One was that during somebody had been shot on a Saturday night or something like that. This is at Durham Young Hospital, and that it was in the belly or something like that, and they're operating on this guy. And back then, it was a 2-lane road to Orlando, and there was no blood banks around. So you called the highway patrol up, and they went to Orlando to the blood bank to bring blood or plasma or whatever, you know, the whole thing was. In the meantime, of course, this guy's having a rough time being operated on. And they would take back then they had glass IV bottles as opposed to bags. And the bottom's screwed off, or you know what I'm talking about. So you can put something in there. And the doctors would go in there and they'd pack it with gauze, and then they'd get like a coffee cup and dip the blood out of the patient's belly and pour it down in there to get it back in them until they went to, got the blood, somebody else's blood to, help them along. And she was explaining that to Dr. Robinson, and he had a general practice, and he said, "My God, we'd never learned anything like that in medical school." But they learned it at the MASH unit in World War II. They had to try and keep these guys alive, and I just always thought that was a good story. Another one was making house calls again. And this is Ronnie Wrinkle that told me this story. She said the couple came in and they were sick. And they were telling Ms. Wrinkle that Dad was out there the night before, and these folks were really, really, really poor. I mean, I don't know if they had a dirt floor or something. I mean, it was not good. And they were telling her that, you know, they had a doctor and all that, and wanted them back in here, you know, the next day. And he only charged them 50 cents. And so she went to my father and she says, you know, no wonder I can't get a raise around here. You charge them 50 cents, I mean, we're gonna be out of business. And he turned to her and said, yeah, I should have said a quarter, but 50 cents was the first thing that came to mind. It's kind of neat. And also on these house calls, I've got that's his bag there, and it's got a prescription pad. And on the side, it's got the office number, and it's got the home number there. So you could always call, get hold of the doctor and that type of thing back in those days. I don't suppose y'all have any of those, do you? No, I don't think so. We were talking about the early specialist, and I, came up with Dr. Perry and Dr. Chu, and about when the hospital was built, Dr. Hux, I think, was the three that I remember during those times. And speaking of the community hospital, that was a real big deal for us in Leesburg. It was a big community project. The Yates family gave the property away to have a hospital. And there was fundraisers for the hospital, to get the money up, to get this thing going. And but they had a problem. They'd have to go to a bonding company to get a municipal bond to pay for this hospital. And the bonding company did not want to give them a bond when you had the competition of Dr. Beneville's hospital and Durham Young Hospital out there on the end. They want to make sure they get the money back. So the city basically went to those two folks and said, will you close your hospital? And they said, not only will we close it, we'll donate all of our operating room equipment, emergency room equipment, and all those things to get us going, so we can have a community hospital that works and can help people. So, and during that time, and I'll be done, Dr. Young was the first chief of staff for Leesburg General, and then my dad was the second. So, and one other thing, and I'm done, I promise now. You walk down hospital, and we would always go there after church, to go eat down there. And where you parked in the doctor's offices, they had a button, or a row of buttons, and I think it was only 12 that we had doctors that were using the hospital at the time. The idea was that when you came into the hospital, if you were a physician, I guess they still have it that way.
100 years ago.
Well, okay, but anyway, we had 12 of them, 12 doctors 100 years ago. They're operating working out of that hospital. Oh, and by the way, it was only the first 2 floors. It's a 4-story building. And everything grew, past that.
Well, that was 1963.
Yes, sir. Right. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. Thank you. I can do it real quick. The middle picture there is special to me because Bill found that looking for the pictures of his folks. And Dr. Beneville took that picture. And we had some others where they were over there at the house, having dinner or something like that. And the far top left was at Durham Young Hospital. I think that would be close in the 50s there. They had their little offices, in the hospital there. The bottom one on the left is my mother, at a younger age, obviously. My dad, I think when he was going to college, and my mother and I. And that's it. A couple more here. The top left, this was, I think he was chief of staff or something, and he was getting pinned by my mother for Doctor's Day. And it described underneath in this clipping from a Daily Commercial that the reason they even have Doctor's Day was a celebration of the fact that ether was invented in like 1860 or something for surgeries. Before, I don't know, they gave them liquor or beat them over the head. I don't know what they did to knock them out. They didn't have ether, and ether was changed everything in the surgical field. Next to that one is my mom and Miss Beneville. And this next one to that one is, I'm not sure who, it was a politician that was in Leesburg. And, but anyway, it was some fundraising thing. My parents and myself are on the right. My mother, these two, one in a nursing outfit. When she nursed here in Leesburg, it was all straight starch. I mean, it'd stand over in the corner, you know, and then she could slide it on. And a picture of my dad and of he and I, and that little toy I'm sitting on was his toy growing up in New Hampshire, and I still got it. His name was Dutchie. All right, thank you very much for your time.
Question
I
for
don't
Ms.
know, no, it's
Beverly.
not a question, I just want to say something to Paul and everybody. And Sherry, I wanted to ask you, when did your mother come to work for Dr. Buchanan?
In 47, 48.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, so I moved to Leesburg in 1954. My father's family was from Leesburg. I was 5 years old, and I was out playing in front of my grandmother's house on Main Street, and I broke my arm. And of course, they took me down to Durham Young Clinic, and Dr. Buchanan was on call, and he took me in. Your mother, talking about ether, laid me down on this table, and I can remember to this day, it was a green washcloth filled with ether. And she put it on my face, and I was out. And the next thing I knew, Dr. Buchanan had set my arm. So that was how I met Dr. Buchanan. I was 5 years old. Well, Paul, not too long ago, sitting nobody else had one of these, a prescription from Durham Young Clinic. This is the pad that they'd write scripts on. He had a sale. He sold his family house, and he had a sale. And I was going through to see all the cool stuff in there. And so I laminated this because I thought it was so cool. And it has Dr. Young on it and also Dr. Chu on it. I also picked up this really cool looking contraption that his father used. And I guess you put it on to get up close and be able to see. It's like a magnifying glass. We have no idea what this is.
So do that suturing.
I guess this had a magnifying glass in it or something, but some kind of equipment that was Dr. Buchanan's, and then everybody knows what this is. Yeah. So they all came from Dr. Buchanan's house, and I'm just gonna put this up here by the bag in case you all wanted to see it. And
Yeah, great story. Thank you, Beverly. Appreciate it. Okay, next speaker is Chris Eaglehart Mead.
I'll have to say that mine is a little bit shorter. I don't have a lot of the memories of my dad's practice and the nurse and everyone else like that. But I do know that my dad was a very, very well-loved man in Leesburg. He had friends all over Leesburg, and his patients also were his friends. And he was born in 1913 in Arlington, New Jersey. He was the third of three boys. And he went to Newark Academy, and he was the third generation of his family to go to Newark Academy. He and his brothers all went there. He was captain of the football team, and in his senior year, they won the state championship. So he got a football scholarship to the University of Virginia. But he decided it was too time consuming, so he switched to swimming. And he was still swimming laps when he was 90 years old. He loved to swim. He went to Hahnemann Medical School in Philadelphia, and he graduated in 1940. He then went to East Orange General Hospital in New Jersey for an internship. And that's where he met my mom over the operating room table. And they, got together. But before they could get married, as soon as he finished his internship, he was drafted into World War II. And I think maybe this is one of the times that really shaped who he was. He was in a MASH unit. His battalion landed on Omaha Beach a day or two after D-Day. And they followed the troops all the way through France to Belgium. They would set up their triage units in the basements of people's houses. And I can't imagine, he only had an internship, and all these wounded young men that they were taking care of. Must have been really traumatic. And I know that at the end of the war, he met a priest in Belgium, Father Emile. And I think maybe that priest kind of helped him get over the trauma of what he had seen. And I know that when Mother and Daddy went to Europe one time, they visited with Father Emile. And I have a picture of them with Father Emile. He and my mom were married May the 4th, 1946. And they headed to Florida. He did a residency at Tampa General Hospital. And I guess that's where Dr. Young must have been looking for doctors to come to his practice, because in 1947, when I was 2 weeks old, we moved to Leesburg, and we lived in Palmore Park in a little rental house on Lincoln Avenue. My brother was born when we lived in Leesburg. My brother George was born in 1949. When I was 5 years old, we moved to Silver Lake, and I grew up on Silver Lake. And Bob and I bought that house when our older daughter was 5, and Bob and I still lived there. And my parents built a house next door, and so my children had the wonderful privilege of living next door to my parents, who were just really, really wonderful people. He loved playing golf. He was never very good at playing golf, but he liked being outdoors with his friends, and that was the main thing. And he was one of the first sort of environmentalist kind of people around here. Everybody around Silver Lake was putting sand on their beaches, but ours was all overgrown. And he and Mom would go out in the canoe at night and watch all the red-winged blackbirds and the egrets come in. So we still have all those bulrushes and stuff in the front of our house. Like all the original GPs he did surgeries, set broken bones, delivered lots and lots of babies. He made house calls, and he really enjoyed making house calls because all these people really became his friends. He was just a warm kind of a person. He spent too much time with his patients in the office. Hazel Hamrick, his nurse, tried to keep him on track, but he would spend half an hour with each patient. So everybody in the waiting room kind of waited a long time, but they didn't seem to mind too much. Some of his patients couldn't pay their bills, but like, I guess it was Bill said, or Paul. Anyway, we received a lot of payments in bushels of fruits and vegetables, especially from Sumter County, and I don't think we ever bought a watermelon. And they were so good back then. One time a fair came through town, and Daddy took out the appendix of the wife of the man that owned the pony rides. Well, they couldn't afford to pay either. Well, George and I got a pony out of that. We got a white pony with a red saddle and bridle. On occasions after church, we would go to the doctor's dining room in Leesburg, in the Room Young Hospital. They had this tiny little room in the back where we would go, and Loretta, who was the cook at the hospital, she would make the best fried chicken. And one of the reasons George and I liked to go there is there was his cabinet about this high, and there was a skeleton hanging in it. We thought that was pretty funny. After Mom died, I would take Daddy to the grocery store, and invariably we would find somebody who was a friend or who was there, a patient or somebody that he had delivered. So he really enjoyed going to the store with me. And on Sundays after church, I would take him to the cemetery south of town, and we would leave flowers for the Youngs and for the Buchanans. And see, Mom died before our children were married, but Daddy got to go to 3 of the weddings, and he also knew 3 of our grandchildren before he passed away. He died in 2007 at the age of 94. Yeah. My dad in his uniform when he was in the Army. Then he's down on the bottom there. He was pretty young there. And this picture up at the top right is when we lived on Lincoln Avenue in Palmore Park. In the middle is their wedding day. They got married in New Jersey at Daddy's brother's house. And that's my brother and I in the bottom right. Mother and Daddy loved to travel. They rode their bikes around Silver Lake almost every single day. They also took a trip and rode their bicycles for several days down the Rhine River with another couple. They took a mail boat in Sweden, and they would go in the fjords all up and down Sweden, and deliver the mail. And that was just a really adventurous trip. And that's, I think, the Colorado River where they were rafting. And that's on the right is his buddy Buck Roebuck. They were playing golf. And just the pictures of Mother Day, the dancing pictures, they would dance at home. They had a record player. They put 840s band music on, and they would dance at home. And then the one in the middle is Daddy with our daughter Elizabeth's daughter. And on the far left is in Heppenheim, Germany. In the 60s, Daddy wanted to get back to Germany where his family was from. And he knew his parents and his grandparents had been to this little town called Heppenheim. So he started doing some research. And we took a trip over there in 1967 after he had contacted several Englehards in Heppenheim. And we had our first reunion there. And we are still friends, and with all of these Germans, the ones that are still alive, and they come over here, and we go over to Heppenheim. We've had a reunion there in 2017. But in that picture on the left, Daddy is receiving the key to the city of Heppenheim. The upper left is Claire's wedding with Daddy, and then Ben's wedding, and Elizabeth's wedding. Those are all that he got to make. The picture in the middle at the bottom is Daddy with Scooter Young, Dr. Young's wife. And on the right is at a christening at St. James of one of our grandchildren. Okay, is that it? Yeah, that's the christening at St. James. Oh, in the middle, I'm sorry. The middle is our daughter married Tom Brooks' son. And the lady on the left is Tom's mother, and the one on the right is Ann's mother, and they're with our 2 grandchildren. And the top right is my brother and his son Philip.
Okay.
Is that it?
That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. Okay, let's speak about Dr. Holland, and I'm going to need some help here. He has no sibling or any children here, but again, we mentioned Dr. Holland earlier. That's a portrait of him, which is actually in the museum here in Leesburg, the Heritage Museum. And then to the left is, I believe, that's the hospital of brick, 2-story structure.
Yeah, it's the red brick.
Right, that was right across the street from basically Byers and in the block between Perkins and 12th Street.
Yep.
And it's where Spanish Oaks condominiums are right now on the north side of Main Street.
Yep.
And
It was the hotel.
and that's apparently a car from the late, early 1930s, late 20s. And the photograph to the top, I'm not sure.
It was a Christmas party or something.
A Christmas party?
Yeah.
Okay. And then another photograph in the bottom right of the brick building, which was actually the hospital at that time. And
Teresa
later.
Holland Clinic, it's called, it's a postcard.
Okay,
And then it was the National Hotel.
it was a hotel, because I remember that was the case later on. It was a hotel where the baseball players stayed.
Yeah, well,
We played the
it was on my
semi-pro
show
teams
for a long
here.
time.
And that's exactly where my father came to work for Dr. Holland right there. And so, next speaker though is Ronald Eugene Young. I've known this boy since we were about 6 years old. Met him in front of the Durham Clinic, watching a parade. You were 5, and I was 3.
Our boys.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for asking us to come and speak to you about our dads. I promise you, my talk is getting shorter and shorter. First of all, I'd like to talk about the history of my dad and how he came eventually to Leesburg and retired here at the age of 85. He saw patients until he was 85 years old. And he lived to a ripe old age of almost 96. So he did well. My dad was born in Jonesboro, Texas, a little farming community out of Gatesville, Texas. And he was the eldest of 5 siblings, and he was eventually known as Bubba to them. Obviously, I mean, he was the oldest. So, his mother always had aspirations of him being and becoming a doctor. And so she got her wish in 1938 when he graduated from Baylor University Medical School. At this point, I'd like to insert just a little tidbit about he was a classmate and friend of a renowned doctor called Dr. Michael DeBakey. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him, but he was very instrumental and in performing the first open heart surgery known across the whole United States. And then he eventually made the first heart transplant. So he and my dad remained friends for, good Lord, I don't know, I mean, many years after they had left medical school. Let's see, after graduating from medical school, he chose Tampa, Florida to do his internship and eventually his residency there. And when he went to Tampa, he met my mother. She was in nursing school to become an RN, I think, or something like that. I'm sure of that. But anyway, of course, they became kind of smitten, and he nicknamed her Scooter. And the reason he nicknamed her Scooter is because she'd scoot down that hall and to this room and scoot down that hall to the next room. And so she carried Scooter for the rest of her life. I doubt very seriously if anyone or most people even knew what her first name was. But her first name was Mavis. I promised myself I would throw that in. And so anyway, they got married. She got her RN and he finished his residency and became a MD. And they both decided to leave Tampa General or Tampa and come up to Bushnell and start a practice from a retiring physician up there somewhere in Bushnell. Working out of their home, very, little facility and all, but they stayed there for 2 years. And he got a call from Seaboard Railroad. Has anybody ever heard of Seaboard Railroad? Well, and you probably remember the Silver Meteor.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That was their luxury, liner, railroad liner. But anyway, they called him to be their company doctor. Well, Seaboard Railroad was a pretty big outfit, probably had from all up the East Coast, probably 200 to 300 employees. So he thought it best to leave Bushnell and go to Wildwood, where their headquarters were. And so he did, in fact, come to Wildwood, bought a little house on 301 there, and practiced medicine for a short time, actually, out of his house, and decided that he needed larger facilities to take care of the railroad employees and an easier way to deliver babies. He delivered many, many, many babies in Sumter County. So anyway, he bought an old boarding house and converted that to Wildwood Memorial Hospital, which is on the bottom left there. And it was, going concern there for a long time. I was born there. I was not delivered by my dad. I was delivered by Dr. O'Kelly. And the reason Dr. O'Kelly came over from Leesburg to Wildwood to deliver me is because my dad was out. I don't want to use this word, but messing around somewhere. And he didn't make it back in time to deliver me. And so anyway, he delivered a lot of babies in Sumter County at that time. Let me tell a little story about that. When we were in Leesburg, I played football for Leesburg High School, and in my junior year, Wildwood High School was coming to town to play us. They were state champions at that time. I mean, they were one hell of a football team, let me tell you. John probably remembers that. Well, anyway, their head coach, Bird Wiggum, has anybody heard of Bird Wiggum? John O'Kelly. Well, he was one great football coach. He asked my dad to be their honorary doctor to sit on their bench while they played Leesburg. Well, you're asking, wonder why? Why do you think he would be asked to be their honorary doctor? Well, I'll tell you why. He delivered 10 out of the 11 starting ball players on Wildwood's team. We were supposed to be absolutely slaughtered that night, and we managed to lose 7-0. It was believe this or not, it was a moral victory for Leesburg, and we rang the victory bell. And that's the truth. And Bob Dennis probably remembers that. So, but anyway, getting back to Wildwood again, We stayed in Wildwood until 1946 and moved to Leesburg. And my dad bought Dr. O'Kelly's medical facility that he had and converted it into Durham Young Hospital. And he managed to doctor out of the hospital by himself for a little while until Dr. Buchanan and Dr. Engelhard finally came in, and all three of them were the resident doctors in Durham Young Hospital. And they ran as a hospital for, well, up until about 1961 or two, when the Leesburg General was finally finished. And I don't want to go into how they asked my dad and all those doctors and Dr. Benaville to shut their practices down, because you've already heard it. So I don't want to go back into that. But Leesburg General was the facility, I mean, back in those days, and how it has grown today, my goodness. So, okay, I might not have mentioned this, but I did want to tell you 3 little stories. The first one is kind of funny. Wasn't funny then, but it's kind of funny. When Farrell was 8 years old, he came down with tonsillitis or infected tonsils or whatever you want to call it. And so my dad scheduled surgery for him to take his tonsils out. Well, the day came, and my dad says, Farrell, you can't eat breakfast this morning because of the anesthesia and so forth, you know, and me being 5 years old, not understanding that was Greek. So I'm a tee-hee-hee and a ha-ha-ha, and you can't eat breakfast and all that. My dad leans over and says, son, you can forget breakfast too, because you're going with him. And he took both of our tonsils out and obviously we've survived that. So that's that story. Now, I've got another story, a life-saving story, similar to what Paul might have touched on a little bit. Back in about 1950, 49 or 50, Leesburg had what is known as a beat cop. And the beat cop would walk down the streets and shake the doors and make sure that they were all locked and everything. Well, he crossed over to Magnolia Street. And Magnolia Street had the old A&P grocery store over there. And so he's getting over there pretty close, and it's got a glass front door, and he notices the lights on. And so he peered in there and saw a man laid out in the aisle in a pool of blood. And so he says, pulls on the door and it's open. Light's still on. So he goes and he looks and he sees that it's Mr. Scott, the store manager, had been stabbed and apparently robbed and left for dead. And so the cop managed to get in touch with my dad and tell him that, you know, that he had a victim down here. My dad said, get him down to the hospital and call 2 firemen, call the fire department, have them send 2 firemen down here as blood donors. So the bottom line is my dad had read a couple of weeks before this that the Russians were experimenting with direct transfusions from one arm to the other. And that's the reason he wanted those 2 firemen to come down there. And sure enough, he directly hooked one of them into Mr. Scott. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, blood tie. Well, back in World War II, I don't think anybody was concerned about blood types then either. But anyway, he transfused the first guy for about a pint, got the remaining blood from the second guy, saved Mr. Scott's life, and Mr. Scott lived for many years after that. Some of you may remember or know or knew Gerald Scott. Gerald was Mr. Scott's son. And every time Gerald would see me, I knew Gerald pretty well, he'd say, "Ronnie, your dad saved my life. I saved my dad's life. And I'm really thankful." And I said, "Well, thank you." So that's that story. Now I've got another little story. Let's go back to Wildwood again. A young couple was having trouble with their little child, crying 3 or 4, maybe 5 hours a night, and wondered if my dad had any ideas how to fix that problem. He said, "Well, if y'all agree to bring your little child down here to the hospital, we will," I didn't know I was that boring.
They have to go to the doctor.
They're gonna get an infusion.
So anyway, they agreed to bring the baby to the hospital for about 4 nights. Well, the first night they came down and they, I failed to mention that they had done everything they could to keep this baby from crying. They'd go in, pick it up and pat it and, and rock it and, all that. So my dad says, "Bring it down to the hospital for about 3 or 4 nights and maybe we can get the problem fixed." Well, first night they brought it down, handed it to the night nurse. She takes it down the hall and puts it in a room and with a crib in it. Turns the light out, closes the door, goes back to her station. Well, sure enough, the baby cried about 3 or 4 hours. So second night they came, same scenario. Put the baby in the room, turned out the light, shut the door. Baby cried about an hour. Third night, brought the baby back again. Same scenario. In the room, turned the light out, closed the door. Baby whimpered and cried about 10 minutes and went sound asleep. Came back the 4th night. My dad happened to be down there then and says, "I don't think it's necessary that you leave your baby here tonight. Take it home, put it in the crib, turn the light out, close the door." He never heard from that couple again. So, anyway, I thank you very much. Oh, I do? No, I'm not. I'm on a roll. Paul mentioned, or somebody mentioned over there, that our dads were every one of us, they were head to toe doctors. I mean, if you had an earache, he'd fix it. If you had an ingrown toenail, he'd operate on it. If you needed to deliver a baby, they'd deliver the baby. Well, not today. We got mostly specialists. And thank God for specialists. I mean, I'm living testimony. I've had open heart surgery. I got a pacemaker to make sure it's ticking okay. So, you know, modern medicine is a wonderful thing. And so is old-time medicine as well. I've got just one little titty bit thing that I'm gonna leave you with. A doctor today, and I'm not picking on specialists, but a doctor today may say, I only work on the right nostril, not the left. Thank you very much. Forgetting about these pictures. I want to go back down here to the left, bottom left. That's the old Wildwood Memorial Hospital that my dad practiced in. These are modern, well, this is a modern day picture of what the hospital looks like now. That's an old picture. Incidentally, the original Durham Young Hospital was a single building entity. And they added left wing, which is up here on the top left, on the left-hand side. That wing was added. And then you can barely maybe see this picture up here on the top right. But anyway, they added those both wings so that Dr. Buchanan and Dr. Young and Dr. Engelhard could have their space. This is my mother, Scooter, and my dad on the right. And this is typically back in somewhat of his older days. The top middle left is my daughter, Kristen, standing with my dad when he was probably about 80, at least 85 at that point. The sitting down picture of my dad, that's his 95th birthday party. My dad always had a pipe in his mouth. Seemed like he went to the Daytona races when we were on the beach one time, standing there in a tie, smoking a pipe. You know, I don't think that's racing attire these days. But that's in the bottom middle. He's standing there with his two grandsons. That's Farrell's son, Durham, and my son, Mark. And that's obviously Farrell and I. But that's about the end, and I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Ronnie, for that short brief. You spoke a lot less than everybody else. Thank you. So, Farrell, do you have any comments you'd like to make? I'll bring the mic over to you. Just stay there. I'll bring the mic for you.
Thank you, John. Well, there's a saying that you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. Many of you probably don't remember or knew that he did grow up on a farm in Texas. And as much as he loved medicine and the practice of medicine, he dearly loved being a farmer. He had a little place down in Webster. And if you'll forgive me, old Doc Young had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, and on this farm he raised some pigs and cows and horses and chickens. And he also grew sugar, or well, I was going to say, he was even known to raise cane. Sugar cane, that is. And he would, along with the caretaker of the farm, we would squeeze the sugar cane and get the juice and render it into syrup, cane syrup. And as I can remember, not having syrup. While he was in the farm business down in Webster, Florida, he and two other men started an egg-laying business. And this was quite a deal. This was back in 1957 or 58. Anyway, one time they had upwards of 90,000 laying hens. And that was a lot of eggs, and every day, 7 days a week, and also a lot of chicken food. Anyway, eventually he sold his home in Palmore Park and moved to Fruitland Park, where he started another farm. Only this one only was about 1/3 of an acre. And he had his proverbial year-round garden, which he loved to toil with. And he also grew or raised what he would term fancy chickens, fancy pigeons, fancy quail. And he also, for livestock, he had goats. But the goat business kind of went out of business. We always had problems with coyotes and packs of dogs, so that took him out of his goat business. I'll end this by saying that I've heard him say it a dozen times. He says when he retired, he needed 3 things. He needed good health, he wanted a good deal of money, and also he wanted a good garden. That's it.
That's Dr. Farrell Young. He's a local veterinary doctor who retired a couple of years ago. So, Dr. Marion Vincent O'Kelly is my dad, and my brother Marion Vincent O'Kelly Jr. is right over there in the yellow shirt. And my dad was born in October of 1904 in the Atlanta area, Austell, Georgia. He lived growing up in Georgia and in Florida, in Gainesville, Jacksonville. His dad was a Baptist minister along with 2 of his uncles. And I believe they established the Druid Hills Baptist Church in Atlanta, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, they came to Florida. He went to high school at Robert E. Lee High School. He then attended Stetson University in DeLand. And he graduated from Stetson, I would think probably in the late 1920s. And then worked for a year or more as a school teacher at Robert E. Lee High School in Jacksonville, Florida. So at some point, either he had to make some money to go to school or decided to become a doctor. I'm not sure which, but he then went to Emory Medical School in Georgia. After graduation, I think he had some intern time, probably at maybe the Grady Hospital, Butch?
Yeah.
Is that in Atlanta, I believe?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's affiliated with Emory University, if I'm not mistaken. So, in 1936, his first job as a physician was here in Leesburg, Florida. He worked for Dr. Holland in the building that we saw before, that brick building that later was a hotel. So he stayed with Dr. Holland, I think, until the early 40s. 38?
When he went to the bank building.
Okay. Then he established his own practice and went to the 3rd floor of the First National Bank, which is where United Southern Bank is on Main Street there next to 6th Street. So he worked there for a while, and then in the early 40s, 1940, Butch, he bought the hospital from Dr. Leroy Otchen.
After the war broke out, Dr. Otchen got drafted,
Right.
had to be a flight surgeon. Dr. Otchen said to my dad, "You're going to buy my hospital." And he sold it to him in early 42, and that's when he opened O'Kelly Hospital,
Right.
where you were born.
Yes.
Almost.
Okay, that was 1942, so he bought it apparently shortly before I was born. And so to get to that point, Dr. Young was my mother's doctor. So my mother went into labor, and they tried to reach Dr. Young. Dr. Young apparently, again, was not available for the delivery. Dr. Young was somewhere, I think he was on a hunting or fishing trip or some other excursion. So,
John, I think he was at the dog races.
dog races. I don't know, maybe it was a payback, I don't know, but anyway. I was very anxious, apparently, to arrive here and see Leesburg for the first time. And of course, Dr. Young was not going to help me accomplish that goal. So in the parking lot, behind the Durham Young Clinic, or at that time, the O'Kelly Hospital, I saw the light of day in the back of the car. My dad had to deliver me. So apparently rushed into the hospital shortly thereafter, but I did survive. So that was an experience I don't remember, but I saw a letter that my mother wrote to my grandfather explaining the circumstances. So speaking about my mother, her name is Barbara Hoffman. She's from Leesburg, Maryland. She went to college in Frederick, Maryland, Hood College, and graduated from there and came down to Lake County in probably around 1937-ish and was the Lake County director of the Red Cross in Lake County at that time. She met my father, and of course she was, in my opinion, a beautiful young lady, about 25 years old, at Mac's Coffee Shop on Main Street in Leesburg, which is now where the Brick and Barrel is located. Okay, so they met and they fell in love, and then later got married at the Holy Trinity Episcopal Church in Fruitland Park, and they had the wedding reception back at Mac's Coffee Shop. And coincidentally, my son did the architectural renovations to that building for the restaurant that's there now. So it's a long history of that location. So Dad was a Baptist, but he attended the Episcopal Church with my mother because she was Episcopalian. And he did come regularly, Father Tom. And so after my father had located his practice in the bank building, he did then eventually buy an old Victorian home right behind the Durham Young Clinic, exactly where Magnolia Street goes westward. Back in the 50s, that property was, that road did not go to the west any further, so they took it by eminent domain. So he practiced there for many years, until that time, and I remember going over there many times with Ronnie after school. We'd walk or ride our bikes with little Maxie Wetstein and go over there and hang out a while, and so we had a good time growing up there. And again, Ronnie and Farrell and Butch and Max Wetstein and Paulie, these guys are a little bit younger than we are. We all grew up together in the hood and had a great time. My dad then had to move several locations after that, and some were 1 year or almost a year he was in the den of our home. And eventually Marshall Wilson, who was then the mayor or the city manager, they detected that this was not the proper zoning for having a metal press. Butch and I would come home from school and come in the house, and there would be patients sitting in our little TV room. And I was hoping one of those patients was going to make it here today. I'm not sure if his brother's here. Is there somebody here by the name of David Clark's brother, Jimmy Clark? No? Okay. Anyway, David is a friend of mine today, and they were there, and he was hoping to come here today, but he had something else to do. So that lasted a little while. Then he went to his final location, which was up on the second floor of what's called the Opera House. At that time, it was called the Store Building. This was probably in the early 1960s or late 50s, I'm going to think. That's where he continued his practice. And he was like many of the other doctors, or all the doctors. He was a country doctor. Very rarely was he home for dinner. He was out making the home calls. And that's what he did. And I came across this physician's daily record book from 1953. So this is 70 years ago. Wow. This was a book that perhaps all the doctors had. They had a daily record of their practice, who they saw, what they charged, et cetera, et cetera. There are some familiar names on here who were patients. Ben Spectel. Okay. There's some you won't probably remember, but Mrs. Mallory was one of his longtime patients. He had a little convenience store on West Highway 44. And he made so many home calls, but the average charge for these office visits were between $2 up to $5.
Wow.
And in these offices, these doctors, he had an x-ray machine. He did x-rays. He had a diathermy machine. Who's heard of a diathermy machine? Any doctors know what that is? You know what it? Well, a diathermy machine is apparently something that kind of emits electrical impulses to help relieve pain. At least that was at that time.
it was a quack machine to get an extra $5.
But a typical day, he would see in his office probably between 22 to 35 patients a day. And he's the only doctor there. He had one nurse. And again, here's a daily total on February the 3rd of 1953. He took in a total of $179, and he saw 23 patients. Okay, so the theory that doctors made a lot of money, maybe not as much as most people thought at the time, but probably at that time it was a decent living, I guess. So.
How about the entry of the Cadillac change?
Oh yes, I'm getting to that. These monthly journals, they had a total at the end of each month. Anyway, one was an entry of his expenses, and he traded in a 1951 Cadillac for a 1953 Cadillac for a total of $1,500 difference. So Dad worked, basically looking at this journal, typically 7 days a week. I mean, Sundays he might have, typically a typical Sunday would be 3 to 4 patients. They were probably home calls. He would, of course, they gave, as the other doctors did, they had their home number, which was 47. They call up Dr. O'Kelly at any time of night, either to deliver a baby or take care of an issue, whatever they're feeling. So that was the nature of the doctors of the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. That's what they did. He had just wonderful hobbies. If he could have been something else, I think he would have been a mechanic. But as you can see on these photographs up here, that's a picture of him back in the 1920s when he was either in his early years of Stetson University with his best friend, Bill Hawkins. And they were on a road trip going somewhere, we don't know where. So he would have probably been in his mid-20s at that time. Then in the middle, of course, is my mom and dad together. Bottom left is another old photograph, which says his first new car, which appears to be 1929. Upper right is my father to the far left, my Aunt Elizabeth, my grandfather, Nathaniel Boaz O'Kelly, preacher, and his wife, and my uncle Nathaniel Boaz O'Kelly. And this is at the Holy Trinity Episcopal Church where they got married in 1938. Back in the day, this was the days of segregation, as we all know, back in the 60s and earlier. And many, if not most, of my dad's patients were of the Black community. And he was very, very kind and loyal to them as well as to the other folks as well. So I'm so proud of his devotion to those folks. He loved old cars. He loved antiques. I think he could have probably become, every time we'd go on a road trip to Maryland where my mother grew up, there was antique shops along the way. Butch and I's favorite thing would be, when we saw a sign for an antique shop, we said, Dad, look over to the left. There's a cow over there. What kind of cow is that? So he would try get past the antique shop, so we wouldn't spend 2 hours waiting. Of course, we had no air conditioning in the car at that time anyway. So we had a successful and abbreviated practice. He passed away at age 64 with a heart issue, which obviously today the technology of medicine would probably have enabled him to live many more years. But some of the good memories are of my mom and dad and the trips we would take together. And one of them specifically was, and he had a very mild temper. And we were young kids, probably in 1948, the trip to California, Butch.
Yeah.
We were in the middle of a desert, and Butch and I were fighting in the back seat and just driving my dad crazy. And forgive me, Father Tom. I won't say the full word, but he said, after yelling at us for a long time, says, "Damn it, Barbara, I can't take this anymore." He stops the car in the middle of the desert, slams the door, he's driving, starts walking down the highway. And Butch and I still remember this so vividly to the day. He went up, my mom was just looking at us, "Okay, boys, you're gonna have to shape up." So, finally, Mom got in the car and drove the quarter of a mile that he'd walked. He said, "Marion, please get in the car. The boys have promised to be good." He got in the car, and we continued on. So, there are a lot of things we all can say about our dads and memories. We can't remember them all. They were also wonderful. We were also fortunate to have the parents we've had, and I knew all of these men and their wives as well. I was very fortunate during the last days to spend the last week with my father. I had just returned from Vietnam in 1968, December, and had the opportunity to spend that week at home with Mom and Dad. Dad had not been feeling well, and he was planning to go to the hospital in Lakeland to get an evaluation done for his heart issues. And he had a call that day for one of his patients. And he said, "Johnny, would you drive me out there on Pixie Hill Road? I got to see this patient." So I took him out there to his last home call. Saw this lady. And then we got in the car with my mother, or he did, with my mother, to drive that same day to Lakeland. And I followed because I was still in the Navy, had to go report to Orlando after I got settled in the hospital. So on the way down, he had a heart failure, and my mom continued on, and we followed to the hospital. But within 24 hours after calling my brother, he had passed. So he had a good life. He had a good family, friends in Leesburg, and we thank you all for being here. And this time, the program.
You got one more.
I got one more slide. Okay. Well, Mom and Butchie and Johnny up here on the far left. And then in the middle, that ornery-year-old kid is me. And that's Butch there in the left, looking at the 1941 Buick convertible that my mama drove. And this is on the front porch at our house, which I still live in. It was built in 1941. And that bench you see in the far right is still on that porch. It has not deteriorated, believe it or not. So that's probably in about mid-1940s, I would say.
John, I gotta say, that picture of me in that convertible reminds me of how embarrassed you and I used to be during the war when all the sailors and the Army guys were in town. She'd take us to elementary school in 1946, when 6 years old, and these guys would whistle at her because she'd have the top down. We get so embarrassed they were whistling.
Yeah. I don't remember that. So in the middle, that's a top. Middle is my dad in a motorboat that he had at that time, and I believe that's the engine that I've still got in my warehouse. It's a Johnson from the 1930s, a little 7 horsepower, 5 horsepower Johnson outboard engine. And then in the bottom is during the centennial, my dad in his 1911 Buick, which he had restored in the mid-50s. And then that's our family picture with Butch, myself, Dad, Mom on the back of the Skeeter. That's what that vehicle was called, was a Skeeter. It basically was just the chassis, wheels, and an engine. And so that's pretty much it. Now, as far as I know this is running a little bit longer than y'all anticipated. I apologize for that. And I've probably been long-winded as much as anybody. But I'd like to open it up for any questions or any comments if anybody would care to do so. If not, we'll turn it back over to Frank.
I just want to say thank you. I've learned so much, and I knew all these gentlemen, and I didn't know any of these stories. So this was really, I really appreciate it.
would like to add one more thing. Of the people here and the doctors represented are, any of you were delivered by one of these doctors, please raise your hand. Oh my goodness, Meredith, there's
Dr. Howard.
Dr. Holland, okay, Roger Clark.
Dr. Holland.
Dr. Holland, and
Dr.
Bobby?
Holland.
Holland, okay.
Dr. Engelhardt. Morrison.
Farrell,
Dr. Morrison.
okay, and
Dr. Buchanan.
Buchanan, okay.
Holland.
Ronnie?
Okay,
Yeah. Butch? Holland?
who in this room ate at Nick Baboris's?
Nick's Cafe, yes.
Comment.
I had more whipping than Nick's Cafe than did at home.
Okay.
Nick was my uncle.
Oh, really?
And Susie.
Susie?
Actually, Susie, his wife, was my father's sister. So,
Okay.
but married.
Yeah, well, we remember Susie, we remember Ruby, the waitress.
Oh, yes, uh-huh.
Okay.
And I want to say one more thing. All of you that were not members of the Heritage Society need to seriously consider becoming a member. Dues are very inexpensive, or you can pay a one-time fee and be a member for life. So,
May I add?
Leesburg.
May I add something to that? Because I was trying to think how to do it. Maybe some of you have already done it, but we have files at the museum. Family files and Leesburg High School classes. We have the yearbooks. But any of you, because obviously you have memories, please donate copies so they can be in the files, because you never know. Y'all are probably, well, some of you, Bill Mahoney, just as an example, and this goes back several years ago, but do you remember Jim Bob Mahoney and Bill Mahoney?
Yep.
Okay.
It's 33.
All right. And Bill married, her name escapes me, but about 5 years ago, a descendant came into the museum and looked in the files, and there was information that they would not have had. But they took the time, and they were in the area, and I don't know if both Bill and his wife had passed at that time or not, but it was just wonderful. They left a check and a letter as a donation, expressing their, thanks for being able to get the information and all. So just consider that, please, because it's a wealth of the history of Leesburg.
Francis is our treasurer. The dues are only $20, right? For the year.
Yes,
What's like?
and I'm now the new manager of the museum, so.
Frank, what is the lifetime membership? Is it
200.
200 is a lifetime membership. Well, John, let me only tell you, you kicked it out of the park today.
Yeah, I was trying.
And we thank you. And we thank all the siblings that came and spoke. We sincerely appreciate it. I know it's lasted a long time, more than our normal time, but I believe everybody that came enjoyed themselves. And we thank you. Next month, if you're not doing anything on the 7th day of March, our program will be Mecklenburg said, and the history. Gwen and her daughter will be here.
And whatever else they want to talk about.
Again, I thank you, Francis, for bringing that up, okay? And again, Bev, I appreciate you bringing it up. Is there any other questions or things that need to come before this organization today? Since I got thrown this job today, if not, I'm gonna call this meeting adjourned.